Halito, and welcome to Native Awa'uq, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakuki.
I am more than a craftsman.
I am more than a firefighter.
More than a teacher.
Than a student.
A business owner.
Than a leader.
A healer.
I am more than a champion.
Chatta ilfinachili.
Chata elefanatili.
I am Choctaw proud.
I am Choctaw proud.
I am Choctaw proud.
We are the Choctaw Nation, and together we're more.
You're listening to part 2 of this series.
So speaking of the corporations, here's a real life example and one that's near and dear to you, Scott. You talked about Old Harbor Native Corp earlier. Tell us about the good things you're doing in your community with that Alaskan Native corporation.
So Old Harbor Native Corporation, I'll give you some context here too about how I originally got involved with Old Harbor Native Corporation. And so, as you mentioned, I'm from Kodiak, in Kodiak City. I grew up mostly in, but spent the summers in Old Harbor, which is the village, 30 minutes south of the Kodiak. And so, growing up, I would spend summers in Old Harbor and attend cultural camps such as Ninyak Camp, which is our Supiat, I believe is how you say it, name for Old Harbor. And so Ninyak Camp was a cultural camp where you got to spend a week or so on Kodiak Island, which is right out front of Old Harbor Native Corporation. And from then on, they kind of planted the seed. And as I graduated high school and went to college, that seed kind of sprouted as I found myself with the option to take Alaska Native Studies classes. And once I got into there, it was game over. That's where I found my passion for Alaska Native history and politics and, Native American history and politics as a whole. And so, from there, I stayed in touch with people at my corporation and inside the tribe. And I was like, hey, what are the next steps here? What can I do to bring the most benefit to our people? And so now, the current state of Old Harbor Native Corporation is they have an alliance, and I guess Old Harbor Village as a whole is they have an alliance between the city, the corporation, and the tribe. And I guess just a little context there too, there's also the city government inside of the village. So you have city, the corporation, and the tribe. And in our particular case, the city, covers the utilities, makes sure all the utilities are working, and the corporation is more so focused on the economic development of the village and the entity as a whole. And the tribe is more so focused on the social services of the village. And so our tribe is currently in the state of transitioning from only social services into more so economic development. And so other things that have come from this alliance are the bison herd we have on Kodiak Island, which is, it's like bison on an island in Kodiak, but no, I love it. It's provided for our community and brought a lot of good attention to us. And a couple other things we're working on right now is also a hydro dam. We just received a grant from the Department of Energy. And we also are I'm not exactly sure on the outline or when the community center is going to be done, but last I was there, they were getting the walls put up, so it's coming together. So they have also a cyclitic sunrise farm which provides for the community members, and so they have lettuce, tomatoes, potatoes, and one of my favorites, apples. And they were showing me the trees, and I was like, I want some of those apples.
Yeah, especially right off the tree. Because they're so
exactly
much better than buying them at the store.
Exactly. But yeah, from there, you just have the scholarship foundation, which supported me throughout my post-secondary career. So yeah, as I mentioned, the tribe's trying to get more into tourism and construction, as those are very big markets in Kodiak and throughout Alaska as a whole. And so now, currently, I sit on the fisheries committee for Old Harbor Native Corporation and also on the board of trustees for the settlement trust, which I mentioned earlier.
Fantastic. You've done a
Yeah.
lot, it sounds like. Well, where can folks find out more about this initiative?
So the Old Harbor Native Corporation has a website. It's www.oldharbornativecorp.com.
I take it the bison herd was not necessarily indigenous to that area, correct?
I don't believe so. I don't think we had bison, but I do know that it's been a very great resource for the village. So,
Right, because y'all were more of a fishing village, correct?
yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we have guiding businesses. One of our biggest markets is tourism for fishing, and that's one of the biggest providers for the community as a whole. We have everything from subsistence to sports fishing to commercial fishing, which provides, food, jobs, and so yeah, that's
Oh, that's great. Well, wonderful. And I'm excited about the bison because obviously I'm a huge fan of all things buffalo. So I'd like to dive into the history of your people, the Alutiiq. What can you tell us about that history up until the point of Refuge Rock?
So yeah, I would just like to preface again, this was not my main focus in school, so I'm speaking from what I've heard and from the little research I've done here. But we've inhabited the lands for over 8,000 years, thousands of years. There's been some evidence that we've been there longer, but yeah. Pre-colonial contact was between 15 and 20,000, and currently on the island, you'll find petroglyphs and you'll find other artifacts in certain areas. And yeah, our people were really connected to the land and sea. As I mentioned, we ate marine mammals, we harvested birds, and yeah, fish. And so we hunted out of let's see here. Let me try my deep throat talk here. Kayaks with so we use fishing hooks and spears. And so actually connecting back to Nunya Camp with spears, I actually was able to carve an atlatl, it's called. And so we didn't throw the spears with our hands, but we had this little board where you'd put the spear in and then you'd throw it from the atlatl, which gave you more distance and more accuracy on the throw. So yeah, and something that's actually a little bit more relative to the Native Americans down here in the gaming world is we used to have gambling games, and one of them is Kodiak, I believe is the proper pronunciation, but there's certain stakes you could have there. And so, yeah, we're a little bit familiar with the gaming.
Yeah, right? Okay. Well, the petroglyphs that are carved into those rocks, did you see those when you lived there?
Yeah, so the main ones that I remember seeing were actually up by Foganac, which you mentioned, which is actually an island right above Kodiak. So there's Kodiak Island, and then there's a little bit bigger island or a little bit smaller island right above it. And when I was younger, we'd go to Digafoganac was another cultural camp we went to, and we got to go out on the skiff and look at the petroglyphs. And it's super cool seeing that they're still there, and our people still have a presence on the rocks there. So yeah.
Love that stuff. Alutiiqmuseum.org states, to protect their families from raiders, Alutiiq people built temporary settlements at the top of precipitous cliffs and small, rocky, cliff-bound islands. Here, families prepared shelters and stockpiled supplies. When communities feared aggression, they retreated to these sites for protection. Women and children might stay at a refuge site when the men in their community were traveling, or an entire community might withdraw to one when they learned of a possible raid. Sometimes people took refuge in the mountains. One elder recalls that Old Women's Mountain, overlooking Kodiak Airport, is named for a group of women who fled from a village at the mouth of the Buskin River. There came a time, like most communities in history, where the native Alaskan people found themselves forced to resist intruders in their land. In this case, the Russians were the invaders. So let's take a look at that. In the 1700s, Russians began trading in the North Pacific coast. Trade was sometimes peaceful and other times not. And at times, the Alutiiq warriors would come after the traders, scaring them away. But Kodiak's environment was rich, and by the 1770s, Russians began to settle closer and closer to the tribe. There once was a Russian fur trader named Grigory Shelikov who had been trading with the natives in Alaska since 1775. In April of 1784, he founded the Kodiak Island settlement in hopes to establish a fur trading business whose workers would be the Alutiiq. In fact, Grigory demanded they work for him, and he began taking them as hostages. And of course, the Alutiiq resisted, but realizing the resistance would be futile, they fled to Kodiak Island, apologies if I got that wrong, across Old Harbor to what is known as Refuge Rock, or Awa'uq, meaning the Alutiiq language, where one becomes numb. After a 5-day standoff, a battle ensued on August of 1784, when Grigory and his Russian men positioned 130 Russians at Refuge Rock to attack the Alutiiq people with guns and cannons, killing possibly up to 500 men, women, and children, although some would say the number could be as many as 3,000 people being killed. Grigory then boasted to have captured 400 hostages, which included children. The Russians, on the other hand, suffered no casualties, and Grigory claimed Kodiak the capital of Russian America. While mourning the death of their loved ones, the Alutiiq had to give up their lands and their sovereignty and were forced into Russian subjugation. This also meant they were now to hunt and prepare food for the Russians and to work for little pay. Men and boys were forced to hunt sea otters throughout the entire year, and women and children were enslaved. Many starved, others died from diseases. The Alutiiq population of 8,000 at the time dropped to just 2,900 people by 1824. But there's another part of the story that led to the Awa'uq Massacre. Why don't you tell us the story of Kashpuk, who was an Alutiiq, from an article from alutiiqeducation.org.
Yeah, so the article states a well-known story of betrayal from historic times is told by Arsenti Amanek in 1805 about Kashpuk betrayed the Alutiiq people at Refuge Rock when telling the unknown portage crossed the islands to the Russians. His betrayal cost the lives of hundreds that day in 1784 and resulted in the conquest of the Kodiak Alutiiq. Perhaps Kashpuk saw no other option after witnessing other atrocities during his own captivity and hoped that the people would surrender. Regardless, his name has gone down in history as a traitor, and today you actually can still go see Refuge Rock, and this is a very, very, very sad story, and so I'd just like to take a moment to recognize that our people are still there today, thriving and working on rebuilding from that atrocity. And there's not necessarily there's feelings that you get when you go out there, and as you said, Awa'uq, where you become numb. It really does feel like that when you're visiting that area. It's on Sitklitic Island, and the bison herd is actually named Sitklitic Island Bison Herd. But back to the story, it's a very sad story, and I've been out to Sitklitic and I've been in that area, and the feeling you get, it just feels like something bad took place. It's almost like being at where an old battlefield, it's like you go out there and you're like, you just get overwhelmed with these feelings. And so, but again, I would like to recognize that our people are still there and, working on rebuilding and thriving again.
So recognized. And that's the thing. I think people often just assume that with some of these massacres and the bad things that happened, that no, we are still here. We are not all gone. There were survivors and thrivers, and yet we do also recognize those who lost their lives in such a tragic, tragic scenario. I also read that Kodiak was actually taken as a hostage as a child and had been raised by the Russians in servitude. And he had learned Russian and had become an interpreter between the Russians and the Alutiiq. So he actually told the Russians the location of Refuge Island, and that's how they came to attack the Alutiiq there. Was this massacre and the story of Kodiak a big topic in your Alaska history class when you were in school?
In high school, but I studied it a little bit more as I got into college. But yeah, I mean, today, again, I just want to mention that there's still stories being told of, women and men sacrificing themselves at that rock. So yeah.
Wow. So more than 50 years after the massacre, Arsenti Amanak, who was a survivor, talked about the attack. Tell us what he said.
The Russians went to the settlement and carried out a terrible bloodbath. Only a few people were able to flee in Badarkas. 300 Kodiaks were shot by the Russians, and this happened in April. When our people revisited the place in the summer, the stench of the corpses lying on the shore polluted the air so badly that none could stay there. And since then, the island has been uninhabited. After this, every chief had to surrender his children as hostages. I was saved only by my father's begging and many sea otter pelts, as stated by Arsenti Amanak.
Wow, the story is just heartbreaking. And if you were to visit the island now, is there information or a monument there to share and preserve the story of what took place there?
No, there's no monument other than the rock itself and the stories that you will hear from my relatives and family and, the locals of the area. And obviously in history books and other resources online. So
what happened to the Alutiiq following the Russian invasion?
So I would say it was a pretty dark period. I believe Old Harbor was one of the first places the Russians landed on the island, and they treated them very badly, and they treated us very badly with, we were infected with diseases they brought to the area, and we were, like you said, slaves. We were hunted. We had to hunt sea otters to, stay alive, and the ones that did make it through the Refuge Rock Massacre. And from there, the Russian Orthodox Church was actually advocating for the natives in my area to be treated better, since the treatment was so bad. They would report back to the Tsar of Russia and be like, hey, we should be treating these guys better. And so you'll still see a presence of Russian Orthodox in Alaska and Kodiak.
Interesting. Yeah, there was a change in Russian management too after 1818. And then in 1867, Alaska was purchased from Russia by the United States for 2 cents per acre. So let's pan out a bit and talk more about the history of Alaska itself as it pertains to Alaskan natives in general. So hopefully I'm saying this correctly, Vitus Bering was on an expedition and spotted Alaska. Then Russians first came into contact with Native Alaskans in the 1700s. And as we know, the trading began. And as you mentioned with that, the Russian Orthodox missionaries came along and they translated scriptures into native tongues such as Tlingit. And as we just talked about, the Alutiiq were in servitude to the Russians, and so were other Alaskan people such as the Aleuts. Is that how you say it?
Yep.
Empress Catherine the Great encouraged her Russian subjects to treat the Aleuts fairly, as you mentioned, but over time the situation unfortunately became more aggressive. Overhunting for trading ensued, and animal populations were in decline, which caused the Aleuts to head into more dangerous waters to hunt for otter in the North Pacific. The Aleuts did try to fight back on occasion, but the Russians would destroy their hunting gear, causing setbacks. Corporal punishment, taking indigenous families hostage until the males would produce furs, taxation, and withholding food were the Russians' means of holding the Kodiak and Aleutian Islands' indigenous people under rule. The Russian Tsarist government continued to consume great amount of Alaskan natural resources, changing the landscape. At the same time, the indigenous culture of Alaskan natives were altered over time as the Russian Orthodox influence spread. Contributing to the morphing of indigenous culture, indigenous women would marry Russian men since males from their tribes would be out hunting for long stretches of time. This intermarrying resulted in a people known as Creole, children of Russian and indigenous mothers and fathers. These children were forced to follow the Russian Orthodoxy's teaching, and they were educated by the Russians as well. After completion of their education, they were sent to Russia and were further educated in theology, military intelligence, and map making. So when I read this, I thought about how there could be descendants of these indigenous Alaskan people still in Russia today if some of them never returned to Alaska. What are your thoughts on that?
An interesting question. Well, the people that got taken hostage and brought back to Russia, as I mentioned, the Russian Orthodox stood up for the enslavement of our people in Kodiak and in our region, and I hope that they had better treatment over there, and they didn't have to go through all those horrible things, and them being closer, to the Tsar and the Russian Orthodoxy, they were treated a bit better, and I would hope that, but I'm sure that's not the case. But yeah, I hope they get to reconnect with their culture and feel that they belong, where they're originally from, and they take the time to do that. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. I wonder if there's people over in Russia who have traced their lineage and are like, how do I have American in me?
The only other correction I'd like to make is that Tlingit, it's pronounced Tlingit, not Tlingit. It's a C sound. Yeah, Tlingit. It's the but yeah, on your comment there about them wondering how they have, Alaskan Native blood in them or American Indian, I actually have, have lineage from Norway. So, it's
Right.
it's all around. Yeah.
It really does.
Kind of similar to how I have Russian lineage as well. So
Yeah. So I your last name is Larionoff. I assume that's how we say it, correct?
mm-hmm. So
if
Larion, yeah,
Larionoff. So
Larionoff.
Russian, right?
Yeah, so actually, Larionoff, I have a second last name, which is Melavidov. Which is hyphenated, which is also Russian, and the spelling ends with two F's on the end of both of those names, which was originally a V. And I actually ran into somebody who still has the last name Melavidov, but it ends with a V. So,
So fascinating.
yeah.
Well, over time, Russia lost interest in Alaska, and in 1867, the United States, who was eyeing the gold in the area, purchased Alaska for 2 cents an acre. At that time, the U.S. didn't consider the Alaskan natives as citizens and stated the land was open land for settlers. Sounds familiar. And now we have an even greater non-native presence migrating into Alaska into 1896 to 1898 because of the Klondike Gold Rush. And with that, Alaskan natives and Americans were now being forced to segregate per discriminatory laws. Whites-only signs started showing up on buildings, and schools were, of course, also segregated. Children who were part Native and part American could only attend school with non-Native pupils if the family agreed to abandon their Native traditions, culture, and language, and wear non-Native clothing. So total assimilation, no ifs, ands, or buts. And speaking of, I tend to forget that Alaskans would come to the lower 48 to boarding schools here like Chilocco. Do you know much about the boarding schools there in Alaska?
So what I've heard about the boarding schools, and what has been passed on to me, and it's not very easy for a lot of elders that went to boarding schools to talk about it. And so what I'm sharing is, out of respect for them, and there's certain things that I won't share, but the stories are very brutal. It's just the mistreatment. You have similarities to the enslavement of the men having to go hunt sea otters. The kids weren't allowed to speak their language, and terrible things were happening to them as they were being forced into a different religion, a different culture. And so the story that I would like to tell is my grandpa, Tuffy, Moses Larionoff, we call him Tuffy, would actually have to go to school in Kodiak. So he's originally from Awa'uq, I believe, which is another village on Kodiak, and he would have to go to Kodiak City to go to school. And he always told me stories about how the kids would just pick on him and beat him up and do just terrible hazing stuff. And so but yeah, the Alaska Natives were sent all over. There was boarding schools inside of Alaska with the missionaries, and like I said, the Russian Orthodox. And there's even stories of people getting sent down to the states, like you mentioned, all the way as far as Tennessee, and probably all over the U.S. So yeah.
They were a long way from home.
Yeah.
And what a different culture.
Culture shock.
Weather.
To say the least. Yes.
Yeah. So sad. So in the early 1900s, Alaskan Natives started to fight back. The A&B, or Alaska Native Brotherhood, was formed in 1912 to fight for citizenship rights. And in 1950, the law was passed by the Alaska Territorial Legislature, which would allow Native Alaskans the right to vote. However, the catch was they had to give up their culture and traditions. Those beautiful traditions and culture. So sad. Then in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed, which granted Native American citizenship in the United States. Now, something that really caught my attention was that in 1942, during World War II, 900 Aleuts were forced to evacuate by the United States, supposedly for their own protection because of a certain combat zone. However, no European Americans living there were forced to leave. And in fact, the evacuation was handled so badly that many of the Aleuts died afterwards, especially children and the elderly. While the Aleuts were gone, their homes were destroyed and possessions looted, so they returned to a disaster. That's just a terrible and bizarre story, probably indicative of how Natives were still treated at the time. But it did lead to the Alaska Equal Rights Act of 1945, which ended segregation due to the good work and help of a Tlingit woman, Elizabeth Petrovich. In 1959, President Dwight D. Eisenhower became part of the United States, and he recognized Alaska as the 49th state. One of the largest natural disasters recorded in U.S. history was on March 27, 1964, called the Good Friday earthquake and tsunami. The Alutiiq's traditional home of Awa'uq was destroyed, so many chose to build a new village on the Kodiak Island. So regarding the Alutiiq's land, I mentioned earlier that we discussed the reason why Alaskans don't have reservations as we do in the lower 48, with the exception of the one tribe you mentioned. Why were Native Alaskans treated differently than other Native Americans in the U.S.?
So they weren't allotted land under the Dawes Act, and instead in 1906 they had the Alaska Native Allotment Act, which was appealed in 1971, hence the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act.
So the Alaska Native Allotment Act you mentioned allotted restricted, unappropriated, non-mineral land entitlements of up to 160 acres. And like you said, in 1971, U.S. Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or ANCSA. So tell us more about ANCSA.
So yeah, well, as I mentioned, I first learned about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in college, and I was originally invited to a graduate level course my freshman year by a guy by the name of William Hensley, and he was a big advocate for ANCSA. And again, I was sitting there as a freshman in this graduate level class as I'm studying to be a mechanic. I'm like, what am I doing with all these professionals
Are you
and
serious?
graduate level students in here? But as soon as he started talking, I was like, whoa, he just started laying it out, and I was engaged the whole time. But what he started to dive into was the big focus of we still had Aboriginal title to the land in Alaska. And so, it's right around when they first discovered oil up in the north. And so they were really, wanted to get this Native Claim Settlement Act passed. And so we use that to our advantage, and Aboriginal title. And so it was obviously a replacement of the Allotment Act, but it established the 12 regional corporations. And Willie Hensley was actually in the office when President Nixon signed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And so him being able to teach from a storytelling perspective, I believe, is what really caught my attention and kept me focused in that class. And so, there was no reservations besides one. I only know of one other community and village that tried to put their land into trust so they could have a reservation, but I don't think it went all the way through. So, yeah.
Well, what are your personal thoughts on ANCSA and, versus the former Native Allotment Act? And what do you think about not having reservations in Alaska?
So I am actually very grateful for the opportunities I was provided through my native corporations, which are obviously a product of ANCSA. I would not be anywhere near where I am today without the corporations, as they provided, moral support, financial support, and just overall giving me guidance into, becoming the person that I am today. And so the now that I'm down here in lower 48, I'm seeing all of the development that some of the bigger economically developed tribes have down here. And I start to wonder, I'm like, what if that was the case in Alaska? Would we be able to capitalize more on the gaming world and also the tourism and not have to follow state jurisdiction? But again, I just think back, like, I would not be the person I was today if it wasn't for all of that. And so, yeah, one of the bigger topics that there's some stipulation around is actually the subsistence rights. And so our subsistence rights were depleted in ANCSA, and that's one of the big things we're working on today to get back is the subsistence rights. And so, like I mentioned, we're not allowed to collect taxes or do anything through our tribe. And so it's a very, very different structure. We still have the city and, the state structure, and we have to follow all those rules. So yeah, there's pros and cons for sure.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So it's interesting, those differences between Alaskan tribal governments and other Native American tribes. As you mentioned, your tribal governments don't collect taxes from business on tribal land. You don't have treaties that protect the subsistence rights except to harvest marine mammals. And then the hunting and fishing rights were eliminated under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. I do see such benefits of the way y'all operate today there in Alaska. I also see there can be pros and cons to both the reservations here and the corporations there. So it's an interesting way to kind of look at the differences there. So on Kodiak Island, the Alutiiq have rights to harvest the marine mammals, but tribal hunting and fishing rights are nada, right?
So yeah, we don't have any of the rights. Like, we still have to go get all of our licenses through the state to be able to harvest. And that's actually something we're working on right now in the fisheries committee, is we would like to have those rights back or figure out a different structure or workaround to be able to harvest a certain amount for our community.
That makes sense.
Yes. It's a work in progress, and I will say all of Alaska is very dependent on the subsistence because everything is so expensive there. You know, we have to get everything either flown or shipped, and so it really inflates the prices of groceries. And so we're really dependent on our subsistence way of life that our people traditionally live. So
Stay tuned for part 3 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.